June 6, 1944 3:47 hours Sector, Utah Beach, Normandy coast overcast wind 12 kts/Nw, the sea churned in slate-gray fury beneath the dim pre-dawn light, landing craft rocking violently as they cut toward the French shoreline where German fortifications waited like stone fangs beneath the surf. Salt spray whipped across the helmets of men who had not slept, men who carried photographs inside breast pockets and whispered small prayers against the roar of engines and artillery rumble rolling from inland batteries. Over the ship's deck clattered the metallic jostling of a machine that did not belong to this kind of hell, a squat square-bodied vehicle no larger than a farm wagon, olive-drab paint still smelling faintly of factory primer, the quarter-ton 4x4 truck that had once nearly been rejected by the U.S. Army Ordnance Board as impractical, underpowered, and unproven. Yet now, on this morning that would carve itself into the bones of the century, it stood lashed to the deck like a loyal dog awaiting release into chaos. Its official designation was truck, 1/4 ton, 4x4, but soldiers called it something simpler, something they could yell over gunfire, Jeep. The voiceover narrator cuts in, low, steady, and grave, like a historian who spent years interviewing ghosts. No weapon, no ship, no general strategy ever wins a war alone. Sometimes history turns because of something smaller. Something humble. Something dismissed. In the hold of the landing craft, Sergeant William "Red" Kincaid leaned forward, fingers trembling as he checked his rifle for the 10th time, though he already knew every chamber was clean. His eyes were hollow, ringed by 3 nights without rest, but something deeper carved the vacancy behind his gaze. 3 days earlier, in a hedgerow outside Corentin, he had watched his younger brother Private Samuel Kincaid bleed out in mud while medics shouted for morphine they didn't have. The regulations were clear: no field personnel could divert vehicles for personal recovery attempts. But regulations did not know the sound a brother makes when he realizes he is dying. Red had broken protocol then, commandeering a jeep to get his brother back to an aid station faster, but the German 7.92mm rounds had torn through flesh quicker than wheels could spin. Command reprimanded him. His captain said war demanded discipline, not emotion. Red said nothing, because grief is a language officers do not speak. Now the jeep stood beside him again, strapped and silent, and he swore he could still see Samuel's fingerprints smeared across the passenger grab bar where he had held on during that final desperate ride. Around them, the engines of the landing craft changed pitch, throttle drop, stance shift, the naval coxswain signaling final approach. Artillery flashed along the horizon. Battleships of the U.S. Navy and Royal Navy were pounding German coastal batteries in thunderous volleys spaced with metronomic precision. Overhead, a low drone of C-47 transports filtered through retreating night. Some still carried paratroopers whose drops had gone off course, scattering companies across flooded fields and bocage labyrinths inland. The mission depended not just on courage and numbers, but on the ability to move, fast, across terrain the Germans believed impassable. And that is where the jeep would prove itself. The narrator continues, before Normandy, the army brass called it unnecessary. They wanted motorcycles for couriers, mules for mountain passes, and trucks for everything else. But a war like this would not wait for roads. A war like this needed something else. The story of how this machine ended up here began years earlier, far from Europe, in a workshop in Butler, Pennsylvania, under flickering fluorescent lights at the American Bantam Car Company. Engineers there had been given an impossible request: design a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle with 4-wheel drive capable of hauling soldiers and weapons across mud, sand, and snow, all while being light enough for men to lift if it was stuck. Other manufacturers laughed. Bantam was too small. Too inexperienced. The Army expected failure. But in just 49 days, the Bantam prototype, the BRC-40, rolled out, boxy and awkward, but sturdy, responsive, and clever in its mechanical balance. Test drivers pushed it over rutted hills, riverbanks, and switchbacks until dust turned to mud and mud to dust again. The thing simply refused to quit. Then came the betrayal. The Army, citing production capability concerns, handed the vehicle's design specifications to Willys and Ford, allowing them to produce refined versions in quantities Bantam could never match. The original inventors were sidelined from the very dream they built. But war is merciless with romance. It chooses what works, and what works is chosen whether or not the men who built it receive history's thanks. On the deck, the Jeep shuddered as the landing craft slammed against an unseen trough, chains groaning. Red closed his eyes. He could smell cordite. He could smell French soil though they had not yet touched it. He could hear a young soldier vomiting behind him, another whispering a verse from Psalm 91 under his breath. Then, over the loudspeaker, the assault officer shouted, 30 seconds. Boots shifted. Weapons clacked. Hearts pounded. And Red placed his hand on the Jeep's hood like a man steadying himself against the world. He did not speak to God, he spoke to his brother, we finish this. The ramp dropped. Machine gun fire ripped the air. The first row of men fell before their boots even met the surf. The sea turned red. The Jeep waited for release. The Jeep waited for release, and when the chains were unhooked and the vehicle lunged forward under the hands of its driver, Private First Class David Mercado, its tires hit the ramp and then the water, sinking for a terrifying heartbeat before torque and momentum carried it upward, foam splashing across its fenders as it clawed toward the shore, engine growling like something alive. Mercado was 22, from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and had never driven anything larger than his father's hay wagon before the army handed him this machine and told him to learn fast. A bullet snapped past his ear, another ricocheted off the Jeep's grill, leaving a bright silver scar in the paint. He did not flinch, because fear had already passed through him hours ago and left only a numb, mechanical determination. Red ran beside the Jeep, water dragging at his legs, rifle held high, seething with the kind of cold fury that does not shout but burns. Ahead, soldiers were dropping, screaming, crawling, the organized assault dissolving into the timeless chaos that every general maps and every soldier bleeds through. German MG-42 machine guns, Hitler's buzzsaws, were firing 1,200 rounds per minute from their fortified casemates, every burst tracing lines through bodies, sand, and surf. Navy destroyers were still firing inland, but their shells could not find every nest, every sniper, every cruel angle of elevation that made the landing zone a killing field. The narrator's voice returns, steady yet shaken by the memory of so many interviews with survivors who lived knowing others did not. War is not won only by strategy or bravery. Sometimes it is won by the ability to move, when the enemy believes you cannot. The Jeep surged over a patch of beach where mines had been cleared moments earlier by engineers wielding Bangalore torpedoes under direct fire. The smell of burned TNT lingered in the air. The vehicle's low center of gravity kept it from toppling on the shifting sands, its four-wheel drive biting and pulling forward where a motorcycle would have slipped, where a truck would have bogged down to its axles. The Jeep was not elegant, it was not powerful, but it could go almost anywhere a man could walk, only faster, and with more to give. Red signaled to Mercado and vaulted into the back while bullets stitched the sand inches from his boots. Another soldier, Corporal Harlan Pierce, threw himself in beside him, blood already seeping from a graze across his shoulder. "Aid post. We've got wounded piling at the seawall." Pierce yelled, and Mercado turned the wheel, pushing the Jeep toward a cluster of men pinned behind a shattered Czech Hedgehog tank trap. One of the wounded was still conscious, clutching his stomach, intestines held in place by trembling hands. Pierce did not hesitate, he hauled the man into the Jeep, and Red steadied him as they accelerated toward the seawall, engine revving high. German mortars began to fall, irregular, frantic, the gunners trying to bracket targets through smoke and confusion. One shell struck close enough to fill the air with fragments of sand, steel, and bone. The Jeep took a fragment to its left front tire, rubber shredding, but momentum kept it moving, tire collapsing but rim grinding forward like a steel jaw. It kept going. The narrator cuts in again, lower now, almost reverent, this was why the Jeep mattered. Not because it was strong, but because it did not stop. They reached the seawall. Red leapt out, dragging the wounded man, shouting for medics who were already overwhelmed, triaging with the grim calculus of battlefield necessity. The smell of blood, seawater, diesel, and gunpowder blended into something that would never wash out of his memory. A young medic with shaking hands took over, pushing sulfa powder into the wound as the soldier screamed through clenched teeth. Red stepped back, chest heaving, eyes scanning the battlefield, and saw something that froze him, a cluster of pinned infantry farther up the beach, cut off by machine gun fire, carrying a radio that had been shot through. They were waving, signaling for help, trapped behind a blown LCVP that was now just twisted steel jutting from the sand. Red knew what that meant. Without communications, they were blind. Without movement, they were dead. Without a vehicle that could cross open ground under fire, no hope. He turned to Mercado. No words. Just a nod. Mercado understood. He revved the jeep again, rim sparking as it tore forward over broken ground, bullets tracing sparks along its hood. Red ran behind for a few steps, then leapt onto the side panel, gripping the frame, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The MG-42 fire adjusted, walking closer, closer, sand erupting in sharp wet puffs. The jeep's windshield, already folded down, took a round through where a driver's forehead would have been if it were raised. The engine strained but did not fail. And then, another explosion. A mortar struck so close that the world turned to white noise and debris. When Red's senses returned, the jeep was still moving. Mercado was still driving, face bloody, eyes unfocused, but hands locked on the wheel. They reached the trapped soldiers. They loaded 2 wounded into the jeep, one barely breathing, the other silent and slack. And as they turned back toward the seawall, Red heard a voice shouting his name, shouting Kincaid, and when he turned, he saw something that cleaved him open, a private running toward him with Red's brother's dog tags in his hand. Found these, on the shoreline, thought you would, the private didn't finish. A sniper's round punched through his helmet, jerking his body backward into the surf. The dog tags fell from his fingers. Red dove. Bullets sliced the water around him. His hand closed on the tags, cold, worn, bent at the edges, and when he rose again, chest heaving, hair dripping salt and grief, something in him snapped back into place, not healed but hardened. He climbed onto the jeep. He faced the German positions. And what came into his voice was not anger, it was purpose. The kind that could move armies. The narrator speaks again, this is not a story about machinery. This is a story about men, and what they carry when the world demands more than they have left to give. The jeep roared on. The invasion did not stop. The beachhead held. The jeep's engine turned over again, coughing smoke and heat, and the 3 men sat for a brief moment in the kind of stillness that only exists between battles, when the world seems to hold its breath before demanding more. Red tightened his grip on the dog tags, the metal warmed now by his skin, not from memory but from purpose. Mercado looked to him, not for orders, but for direction, because by now command structure meant little compared to the gravity in a man's voice when he has decided what he will not allow the world to take from him anymore. Red pointed toward a gap in the orchard leading deeper inland, where the hedgerows thickened into knotted, ancient defenses that the Germans believed impenetrable. We push until we reach the 506th. They're cut off near Saint Marie-du-Mont. They need wheels. They need ammo. They need us. No one questioned. No one hesitated. The jeep lurched forward once more, tires grinding over roots and stones, engine knocking like a heart too tired but unwilling to quit. As they advanced, the countryside echoed with overlapping sounds, distant tank treads, muffled mortar thumps, clipped German commands, and American voices shouting coordinates through burst-open radios. Every mile inland was paid for in blood. Every hedge was a fortress. Every ditch was an invitation to die. Yet the jeep moved, and where it moved, men followed, officers waving forward small squads, medics shouting at stretcher teams, signalmen hauling cables through shell craters, artillery spotters climbing onto tractor roofs to get line of sight. The narrative of the invasion, the part written in textbooks, would speak of naval bombardments, paratrooper drops, armored divisions pushing inland, but the unwritten truth was that messages, medicine, ammunition, rescue, reconnaissance, and hope moved on 4 small wheels. By the time Red's jeep reached the paratroopers near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, the men there had been pinned for nearly 6 hours, rifles nearly dry, their wounded lying under apple trees that should have offered shade for lovers in July, not dying soldiers in early June. And when they heard the sound of that engine, a strained, battered, limping engine, they did not cheer loudly. They simply breathed, shoulders lowering, jaws unclenching, because sometimes survival sounds like a small motor refusing to stop. Supplies were unloaded. Wounded were loaded. Coordinates were relayed. German pressure wavered. A line was held. And in that holding, a road was opened for the armored columns to finally break through. The narrator returns, voice carrying both sorrow and pride. History remembers D-Day for its scale. But scale is made of small things. A letter carried. A wounded man moved. A message delivered. A road crossed under fire. Days later, after Utah Beach was secured, after Corentin was taken, after the hedgerows were drenched with too many names carved forever into white crosses, Red stood beside the same jeep, now riddled with holes, its hood dented, its frame bent, its front rim worn nearly to nothing. An officer approached him and said the vehicle would be scrapped, dismantled for parts, replaced with a newer, cleaner unit. Red said nothing for a long time. Then he stepped forward, placed his hand on the hood one last time, and whispered, quiet enough that only the machine could hear, "We finished it, Sam." The dog tags hung from his neck, no longer a wound, but a weight he chose to carry. The jeep was taken away, not to glory, not to museums, but to a supply depot where mechanics salvaged what they could. But its echo remained, across fields, across villages, across Europe, wherever soldiers later told the story of the little machine that never stopped moving. And long after the war, when roads replaced hedgerows and tractors replaced tanks, farmers in Normandy would sometimes find small twisted pieces of metal in their soil. They knew what they were. They did not throw them away. Because some history is not written in books, it is written in the land. The narrator speaks one final time, soft, grave, unbroken. The jeep was never supposed to win a war. But on the day when the world needed movement more than machines, it carried the weight of men who refused to fall. And because it moved, the line held. And because the line held, the world changed. The screen fades to black. The engine, faint and distant now, keeps running.